All right, so you all are in for a treat today. We have our directors team at Out and About here for our on-purpose interview. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, but we are really looking forward to chatting about website redesigns today. So we're going to get into the whole process, what it's like, and specifically, we're going to talk about our website, Out and About Communications. We just redid our brand. We'll talk to that more in a minute. And now the next big hunky item is a website redo. So before we get into all of that and what the process is like, I'm going to go ahead and do a round of intros. So, Jimmy, why don't we start with you?
Okay, cool. I'm Jimmy. I'm the marketing director. So at Out and About, I just work to kind of help clients come up with strategy. Of course, work with the rest of the directors team to just like how to get clients to where they want to go. Yeah, and I'm excited to share more about our website today. Tiffany?
I'm Tiffany. I'm the content director. So I help our clients kind of find their brand voice and make sure that all the communications, written especially, really align with that brand voice and as well as their goals. So making sure that everything is pointed to the target market and all of that. So all words basically come through me, and that's what I do. So on to Ellie.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Ellie Alexander. I'm the design director here at Out and About. And so what Tiffany is to words and voice, I am to visuals and design. Whether that's helping one of our clients like build a brand from the ground up and like, oh my gosh, we're starting at zero. What does that then look like? And working with our team of designers to craft that. Or further on down the line when we've got everything locked and loaded and we're rocking and rolling, just making sure the brands and visuals all stay consistent. So that's my world.
Awesome. So, websites are sometimes put out there in the world. Like you can literally redo a website overnight. 24 hours, you've got a brand new website and it is exactly what you want. Well, we're here to tell you that you can make that happen, but it's probably not going to be exactly what you want because websites are kind of like mini business plans. It really forces you, if you're really doing them end to end, to go through a bigger picture exercise and really think about how you want to be positioning yourself, especially in this very digital day and age. Your website is sort of like your office front, right? It's really that first introduction that a prospect, warm or cold, is going to have to your brand. So we, in another episode, which we can link to, went through a whole rebranding exercise. Ellie was on that and talked about what our whole brand looks like. Very, very proud to be able to put that out there. And major shout out to you, Ellie, and to the team for the work that was done on that. And all the compliments and things that we've been received. So very proud to be able to put that out there. But that was a whole exercise to go through. So now we're going through the whole website component. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk through what these stages look like. We're going to go through our wireframing, which is our first stage, really strategy heavy and really thinking through those big picture components. We're going to get to the design side of it and how you show it visually, and the copy, how those are married together, and then the build and launch. But really with the team here, we're going to focus on those first two phases, the wireframing, copy and design. We'll get into a little bit of the build. But I'm going to go ahead and hand it, before we get into all of that, why don't we start with why in the world would you do a website redesign? Because it is such a darn hunky project. So anyone just want to speak to that before we get into the different phases? So
Okay, I can add to that. So I think we would kind of visit the idea of a website refresh or a website redesign. I think just for a couple of reasons, maybe evolution within the company. You have new like service offerings. Your team has changed significantly. You're doing something different, or new technology. Maybe there's a function like for those that are selling like consumer products, they have the WhatsApp chat function. Like that could be something that's helpful to the customer service. They could just do a web refresh, and also just um, sometimes it's just like living in the same house. You just want like a fresh coat of paint just to make it look fresher. People that come to your house just feel like, oh, okay, it's a little bit different.
any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, echo everything what Jimmy said, but yeah, especially if you're, if you or your audience has changed, I think that's a big one. Like maybe your website is technically fine, like it works, it's on brand, or maybe it's not. But yeah, if you've realized that your company has changed enough that your website is now like kind of appeals to the wrong group of people, or you need to like hone in more on a specific subset of who it should appeal to, whether that's what it says, the content, or the design. Or this is going back, and I hope I hope nobody is like this, but if it is not mobile friendly, if your website is so old that it is the same on a desktop computer as it is on a mobile device, definitely time. Definitely time. I think most people have caught up to there, but there are still a few stragglers out there.
Yeah. Tiffany, any thoughts too?
Yeah, I mean, I think they pretty much covered it, but I think the only other thing is just, well, I always say like your website should work hard for you, like it should be an asset. And so I guess just the other layer is just if it's not really like serving you or doing what you want it to do. Because I think it's easy to your point earlier that like turnaround 24 hours thing, it's easy to just like slap a logo on and type some copy and I have a website, but there's so many things your website could be doing, right? Whether it's SEO or maybe it's a lead generation tool or just so it's figuring out what that passive marketing for you, what you want that to be doing and then building it from there. So
Yeah, that's a good point, Tiffany. There's a big difference between having a website and having a targeted, strategic, accessible, SEO optimized website. It's night and
yes.
day.
Exactly. And that's where it becomes a whole redesign. I mean, so, with some clients, we do just pop in and like, let's make a few tweaks. We're not looking to do, but, the question of why do a redesign is for this, like, let's just take it all down to the ground and rebuild based on what sort of strategic decisions we want to make.
Yeah, that house analogy is a really good one, Tiffany, that you were alluding to, and Jimmy as well. So let's talk about the break it all down component, the first phase. So, Jimmy, can you talk us through that wireframing phase? Like, what's it about? If you were going into that phase, what should you be prepared for? Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think, it's really about just kind of thinking about the target audience, who will be using the website, who do we want to attract, and then how they will be using it, and then why they would be there, how they would get there, all of these questions, the usual what, why, and then really building that out, putting yourself into the shoes of both the person that's having the website, the company that's having the website, and also the user. How do we want them to kind of navigate them, leaving like little breadcrumbs, and they're following a certain path that you want them to follow. I think that really helps with the wireframing, that intention. Yeah.
Do you mind sharing a little bit more about like what an information architecture is or kind of navigation and what a wireframe is? You hear these words and they're very jargony. And what would that kind of quote unquote deliverable look like if you were to receive that once we've started to kind of unpack those big picture questions?
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to kind of start with the information architecture, which really is just it's almost like building a web, like a food chain, and then kind of like, oh, this is the homepage, this leads to this. It's just a visual representation of where content sits and just how it's organized in an optimal way. And then from there, you could take like each component, which will be the web page, and then you kind of take it, build another visual around it, and then just, yeah, it looks like a website, but it's just a web page, but it's just really like a skeletal outline. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think about like if you were to go in and write a piece, right? You write a blog or what have you. It's like that outline, right? Before you actually get into filling it in that wireframing. And then I love the this kind of skeletal idea of information architecture because it is really it helps you think about like what's the organization, right? It's like if you've got a file cabinet but nothing's labeled and it's all kind of shoved in there, it really helps to kind of get through that organization. And then Jimmy, how long does that process normally take in that kind of phase one engagement? Is a lot of meetings? What is that kind of like? What's the responsibility at someone else's end?
Yeah, I think it really depends as well, like how intricate all the pages are, how many pages. I think that influence it as well.
Mhm.
I would say maybe it takes, like, first we'll have, obviously a meeting with the client, kind of understand where they're at, what kind of content, just the what, the why, and things like that. And then once we have that, really it's building that information architecture, then I would say that takes maybe like a week or so, and then another maybe week or two, I guess, back and forth with the client to just get it ironed out. Then we build web pages itself, the wireframes of the individual pages. So yeah, I think that whole stage to get it complete, depending again on the pages. If we're talking just a simple website, maybe 6, 8 weeks, I think.
Yeah, something around
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah.
it can really ebb and flow, depending on the number of templates or versions or things of that sort. It's part of the creative process, but that sounds about right. Um, okay, so wireframing is a big component. Any key players that should be in those conversations too, that you would want to make sure that are helping to shape that, just to kind of go back to that initial discovery. Who would you want to have in that call?
From the client side, or
Yes. Yes.
yes, okay. So from the client side, I think really just, like the sales team.
Mm,
I think that would be helpful just because again, the website is very much a part of the sales process nowadays. I mean, it's
yeah.
part and parcel. So I think the sales team's input that would help. Obviously the marketing person, I think that would help because they would really understand their target audience really, really well and how that whole process of sales like just unfold. So we
Hmm.
want to make sure that they are involved so that the website really just fits nicely and help to move things along faster instead of causing hindrance.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then I know sometimes we've brought in like key leadership, just depending on the size of the company or what have you, to help shape things out. So I love that point about the sales team because that's so true. That's like a kind of marriage between sales and marketing, right? Making sure that that's brought out as well. Um, So let's thank you, Jimmy. We'll jump over to Ellie. I want to hear about phase two when we get into the design component of it and the copy and the marriage between those. So once we've got the wireframing in place, I know we have an internal handoff here, um,
Mhm.
to make sure that we're all on the same page. And Ellie, maybe kind of we'll transition from Jimmy to Ellie here. What does that look like for you? Like, where do you even start, right? Like,
Right.
yeah, sometimes people want to go totally different direction. They're like, my website was built in the 90s, like, so tell
Mhm.
us about that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a whole can of worms. It can go a couple different ways. But I think, in an ideal world, I'm gonna, assume that we have, even if the website's really old, I'm gonna assume that we have, some sort of updated brand guidelines. Because if you do have a website that is, umpteen years old and you're doing a complete flip, you want to make sure you have something like on the horizon set that you're working towards. So whether we could use that website as kind of like a use case or like a proof of concept for what the new brand would look like. And then that kind of becomes its own exercise of saying like, okay, we don't know what this brand is going to look like, or we're evolving yours. We'll use the homepage to kind of like figure out what feels right. And sometimes we do that with clients with a print piece. If they just have a print piece on hand, you're like, okay, we need to update our onboarding brochure, and sometimes then we'll use that as our example piece to kind of drive the new brand. But yeah, you could absolutely use a website. But then let's say you had the brand all figured out, then I think the next stage would be just asking lots of questions, because sometimes, designers may or may not have been, and myself may or may not have been in certain conversations about like, okay, why is this on the wireframe? What functionality do we need it to have? So having that meeting where we probably pepper Jimmy with lots of annoying questions of like, okay, what do you mean by this? Okay, what kind of stuff is this going to be in this dropdown? What do you need? Okay, what's the user going to do here to make sure we like really like holistically just like, yes, get the brain dump of everything on that website so we understand it, back frontwards, backwards, inside and outside. And then we can kind of start making sure the functionality is there underlying, and then start putting like the brand frosting on top.
Yes, I know. I love that. The brand frosting. That's so fun. Tell me a little bit more about that, right? Because that website is so critical to all the
Mhm,
other pages, the home pages, right? So you've got your global elements, your header, your footer, your typography, like kind of how do you go about choosing that brand frosting, if you will, like you said, to like really
mhm,
kind of spice it up? Because web design is different than print design,
mhm.
right? So what's the direction that you're giving to our designers to really be able to help kind of bring out that right that right feel
Yeah.
for the client?
Mhm. Well, I think a big part of it too is like I'm gonna kind of getting into actually like the tactical weeds part of it is knowing what platform we're designing for. Like, are we building this website on Webflow where we have lots of creative freedom and we can, whatever we envision with this brand, whether it's, really expressive big animations or huge type, it's more of sky's the limit type thing. Or let's say we're doing a smaller website that, may need to be updated more frequently. So we're using a more user-friendly platform like Squarespace where the client can kind of go in and do their own updates. But then our designs are a lot more limited, like, or what we can do, like the capabilities. So then it becomes more of an exercise of like, okay, how can we bring like maximum brand personality into a platform that might already be pretty locked down?
Okay, so do you mind sharing a little bit more about our website, right? We're going through that whole design process. I mean,
Mhm,
we did the information architecture and Jimmy, we can swing back to that process for us too, but the design was such a critical component because we had
mhm,
just gone through that branding exercise. How
mhm.
did you go about kind of bringing that to life? And is there anything that came out of that you're like, yeah, that feels totally like us, you know? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of our design process in particular.
Right. Yeah, I think a big part for us too, and I think, would be the case for lots of brands. But yeah, as you said, like we already had new brand guidelines. We kind of knew what the brand's gonna look like. We had our colors, we had our illustration style, we had the logo, but we hadn't yet like designed any big full pieces. So, even within, sometimes you think you look at a brand brand guidelines, and that should tell you exactly what everything should look like. And it can, but even within that, it's like, okay, how, we use those like fun kind of like liney to turquoisey gradients. How much of that is on the page? Because if 3/4 of the page is full of brightly colored gradients, it gets a totally different vibe than if, okay, we use that very sparingly. Or how much of the black we were using. Like we had all the parts and pieces, but it was kind of like, okay, what are we maxing up, what are we trimming down, to kind of like find just that right balance of how all those pieces interact.
That's so right. And then just to kind of layer in there, for us, as we were building out our brand, we had to even start to create like social media graphics and different
Mhm.
things as a baseline. So we kind of knew how it would play. But Ellie, you did
Mhm.
such a great job of leading the team to really say, now, how does that translate into digital
Mhm.
experience?
Mhm.
Um, can you talk also a little bit more to like the animation component, right? Because we're not just designing in flat files. Like, what does that kind of show up as someone who's actually reviewing like a quote unquote design before it's going to be built?
Yeah, well, I think we are, in this case, we are really blessed to have a really talented developer working with us. Josefina is just fantastic. And so it's been such an asset to have, because I can visualize, oh, wouldn't it be neat if the animation does this? Or wouldn't it be neat if the animation does that? And so can our designer. But we were able to just say, okay, we know we want this to move. This is what we're thinking. Josefina, what do you know? What can Webflow do? What have you seen out there? Because, she's
Right.
probably closer to like the web industry and where trends are going. So we could kind of like seed her with, okay, we're thinking this, we want it to feel this way. And she could almost always like take it up a notch. Be like, oh, I see what you're saying. What about we do this? Or, okay, this new thing is trending. Oh, this is going away because of XYZ.
Yep.
So in terms of animation, she could really like point us in the direction of, okay, and also what's feasible. There might be two options that are like equally great. Oh, we could animate it like this. Oh, we could animate it like this. This might take 10 hours. This might take one. And they're
Yes.
really, we like on the same amount. So then like, let's go with the more efficient one if they're, all things being equal.
Totally. I mean, to Jimmy's point earlier about having the marketing sales team in the discovery, there's a marriage there. There's a marriage also between design and development, right?
Yeah.
And if you break out the two, I feel like the outcome isn't as strong. So,
Mhm.
um, okay, super. I want to make sure we get Tiffany in here. So once we've got our design, we've got our wireframing and everything in place, we've got our designs, then there's that, maybe we kind of talk about that handoff again. And how do you make sure that like it doesn't feel like copy's just like, hey, I'm over here and the design's over here, and they're not really like, whoop, you know? So Tiffany, you mind talking about that too, right? Because some people are visual, some people are words people. How do you partner with Ellie too and the client to make sure we get really that right voice and tone that goes, they're talking to me, you know? So
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about that because I mean, as far as the actual workflow, copy does come at the end, technically, but I think part of it is just the three of us work together really closely all the time. And I think it's just a lot of communication. So I'm talking with Jimmy as the wireframe is being built out. Do we need this kind of content? What kind of story would we tell here? That kind of thing. And the same thing with Ellie, like, would we, she'll come to me like, should we do this picture or this? But like, what kind of story are we trying to tell so that when it does come to the copy stage, I mean, technically, I'm kind of, we're kind of in a box because now we're, the design is all built out and the lorem ipsum is there. But really, we've been working together all along. So we sort of know what each of those sections or whatever is going to say. So then it's just pulling out the voice and, the details of like, who are we going to talk to and what are we going to say? Which words would they use? So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Just
and
staying.
Tiffany, how do you even like kind of like the question to Ellie initially, like how do you tee that up with a writer? Because there's so many different styles of writing, technicality, voice tone, and to be able to really get inside of the prospect. So when they're reading that, they go, oh, they're talking to me. Like this feels like
Mm.
me, you know? What's that evolution like to be able to get from concept to like actually reading it on the page?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Ellie's point earlier, if we have a good brand guide in place, that really helps. If we sort of know where we're trying to go, I mean, we'll always say this, the three of us, but like if we have a brand personality, that's super helpful if we know what, what we're trying to get to. So that does help. Um, but even then, I mean, I think this is the unpopular answer, but the reality is that there's going to be a lot of give and take and back and forth. With the client, even with ourselves, there was a lot of like, that word doesn't feel right. I would actually write this. And I think just being open to that process really helps um, because websites are very close to us, but words are also very close to us. And so I think just being open to like, okay, we know that's what we wanted to say generally, but we'll make a couple tweaks here and there and make changes and just work through it.
Yeah, so well said. I know at that stage in review, we've sometimes had sales folks come in and even take a look at it too. Swing them back.
Yeah, it really helps to have the key players involved because to Jimmy's point, right? Like sales is going to be using these pages all the time, or sales or the team is going to be using these all the time. So they really need to make sure like we would never use that word, and sometimes nobody would know that until it's actually honestly, maybe none of us would know that, but nobody would notice it either until it's like, in the design stage or even on the staging site. Like, oh, now it's, standing out to me. Like we would never say that. So I think, yeah, just again, being open to the process and working together is really important.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really enjoy is that we take the design and we drop the copy in there.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
feels way different. I feel like reading copy off of a document versus in the design. I like Tiffany, anything you want to share regarding that? And even Jimmy, sometimes you could play in there. You're like, okay, but this is what we meant for it to go for this. Or why did it go this direction? Because fill in the blank. So yeah, anything about that stage, this is pre-built. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it just,
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead. Yeah, you got it. We're excited.
yeah.
So yeah, one part of like the iterative process is like, as we've been saying in general, it goes, from wireframing, we go to design and then copy, generally kind of writes to the design, like the design, if we realize, oh, we need much more content here, it might come back to design and we might adjust something to make room for the content or vice versa. But another thing we intentionally did was, especially across the site, in the hero components or when there was like a really big, call out, like a big piece of beauty copy. We knew there was going to be some big statement here and we knew it was going to hit home some message, but we didn't know exactly what the words were going to say. We didn't waste our time yet, like going and finding the perfect image to go with that, because in all likelihood, we could kind of steer the image could have steered the copywriter in a direction that might not have been as impactful or just might not have made sense. So we said, okay, we know there's going to be some big, beautiful statement here. We're just not going to worry about what imagery goes with that until it's written. And then we'll come back and we'll find the perfect image to to correspond with that copy.
Yeah. Any other thoughts too? So well said. And I love you. You'll do the for placement only, just like, hey, we could go down a whole rabbit hole finding the perfect one, but then it just doesn't copy. You're right. They have to speak to each other, right? So it's not
Yeah, it's just a matter of working closely together. And as I was saying, like it's just about telling the right story. So sometimes that comes from the image first, and sometimes it comes from this. Because we've built sites too where like we've put so much effort into an animation and like it doesn't matter what the words say. Like that's the story, and then we will tell the story with the words later. So sometimes it goes either way.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, this whole process, as much as we described it in almost like a linear way, it's not like, playing the telephone game where the information goes one way, that's back and forth. So there's, maybe at Tiffany's stage, she may come back and say like, hey, when you put this here, what was your intention? Even, right down the design stage, or sometimes when everything's laid out, and then it's kind of sent back my way, kind of like, okay, did this kind of fit with that initial vision, and it's everybody's vision. It's not my vision. It's not just a client vision. It's like a collaborative vision to make sure that it works for everyone because it has to.
Yeah.
Yeah, the iterative process isn't like this. It's like this.
So creative. It's part of it. Yeah. Yeah. And we didn't even get into like SEO or other components that could also video that could also ebb and flow with the way of that, the way that it turns out. So well, just for time's sake, I know we didn't get into the build side of it as much, but once we go through in phase one, really the wireframing into phase two, the design and copy, then we get into the build, which is a whole technical component onto itself, and then the iterations to make sure that it's ready to go for launch, as we alluded to earlier, mobile ready, responsive, testing on various devices and actually just like feeling it and kind of like the real environment. But just as we, and I think we could talk about this for hours, honestly. But just as we kind of narrow in, any kind of final thoughts for folks if they're thinking about redoing a website, maybe they want to just add, as Jim you alluded to earlier, a new coat of paint, something like that. Just thoughts that you might want to kind of close with this process at large.
Yeah, I'm kind of going to echo what both you guys said, but I love the idea of like thinking about it like a house remodel. Like it doesn't have to be a gut job. I'm actually in the middle of a house remodel right now. There is nothing on these walls. This house is somewhere in the middle. We're gutting parts of it and keeping other parts. But
It's part of it.
sometimes, sometimes you got to tear it down to the foundation. Sometimes you're moving across the state, or sometimes you're just like, yeah, coat of paint, touch things up a little bit, and then we'll be good to go.
Yep.
So yeah, you don't have to scare yourself by thinking it has to be an all-in, has to be down to the ground demo job. It doesn't have to be.
And that reminds me, just like a house, when you're going to re-gut it, sometimes you get it and you're like, whoa, didn't know this was here. Sometimes when you go through the process and you get further along, you go, oh my gosh, like what about blah, blah, blah? Or I didn't realize da 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 da. And so that's part of, like you were saying, Ellie, it's just part of the creative process. And that's for everyone, even if you're in a creative seat or not, like quote unquote creative seat. We're all in creative seats. So, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think like going, since we're going with the house analogy, I think just really listening to your gut. I mean, if kind of like the house as well, right? Like if you kind of feel, yeah, I wish there were more like power sockets here. I wish, there was one more room for this like third child that I'm expecting. Like listen to your gut. It's the same thing with website. If it's not flowing in a certain way, then it may not be a whole refresh. Don't be like kind of, whoa, I need to tear the whole house down and build it again. Sometimes it's just a fresh coat of paint.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's still very strategic things we can do to ensure that it's, aligned with your target, speaking to your target market, aligned with your goals, that, we can really get it working for you and not just kind of a business card or brochure on the internet. So I
So
agree.
well
There's
said.
a lot of different starting points and endpoints along the way.
Yeah. And I know like we've even done just, can someone just look at my website and just give me like what a fresh coat of paint look like? Not even like the full end to end, the whole wireframing and this and that. Like we kind of alluded to earlier, there's various kind of flavors of redesigns or upgrades that you could do. And so you just kind of have to decide where you're at, what your appetite is for undertaking a project, and it helps to steer you accordingly. So well, thank you all for being here. This was super fun. I started off with you're in for a treat, and you guys, it's always totally delivered. So it was fun to unpack this a little bit more, and hopefully provided some context of what it's like to do a whole website redesign or a component of it. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks.